It's been a little while since I've been behind this microphone. I think I was starting to miss it a little bit. But I'm happy to be back, and I'm happy to announce a new sort of ICU stream I'm going to be starting. That's called Collecting My Observations, otherwise known as CMO. In my short 3 weeks that I've had in the ICU, I've come to appreciate the fact that I'm going to be leaving with a lot of different stories pretty much every day on the job. Can almost never know what to expect going into a day, and it makes for particularly very entertaining stories. So, what can you expect from CMO? Well, each episode I'm going to try and talk about different topics that come up throughout the year and really just give you a first person perspective of what it's like being an ICU fellow and just kind of hear my perspective of how I handle the job, what I see on a regular basis, and common themes that come up. This first episode, I'm going to talk about what it's like describing this job to a lot of people in my life who aren't really medically trained or ever had to work in a hospital environment and what that experience has been like. So stay tuned to hear more about that, and welcome to CMO.
Welcome to Collecting My Observations. Enter into the stream of thoughts that flow through the mind of an ICU fellow who is on his way to becoming an anesthesiologist and intensivist. This is where patients live on the verge of life and death.
So in this episode, I'm going to talk about what it's been like describing this new job to people in my life. And I have 3 different scenarios of groups of different people that I talk to who, like I mentioned, have no real medical background. And having to describe a job in the ICU to someone who either hasn't had a family member in the ICU or doesn't really know what that environment looked like can be a little bit challenging. So the first group I'm going to talk about is a group of college friends. My wife and I were visiting Vermont a couple weeks ago, and I had pretty much just finished hospital orientation, and I think I had about 2 or 3 days in the trauma ICU at that point. And I had driven up separately because my wife was already in Vermont, but on my drive up to Vermont, I was thinking to myself, I know these people are going to ask me how my new job is, and I need to have an answer for them. So I took some time during my drive to ponder over this question and try and formulate something that made some sort of resemblance of something relatable to the group there. Both of the people there had business jobs, although Lillian's roommate was a nurse, so I knew she could always sort of understand. She was an ICU nurse, so she's probably the only one really with any perspective of what I'm talking about. But what I ultimately came to was talking about what it's like being almost like a manager of the ICU team. So as a fellow, I'm basically in charge of making sure residents are providing the care to the patients of the ICU. So the format for most ICUs is there's a team of residents, and the residents are in charge of all 8 to 12 patients or however big your ICU is. And ultimately what they do, they'll show up in the morning, they'll hear about what patients were new to the unit overnight, how the current patients did overnight, and they will do a physical exam, check the lab values, bring all of that data to what we call rounds, and around beginning of the morning, like 8 o'clock, we will start the process of what's known as rounds. And so during rounds, the residents present each patient, and we will talk about overnight events, any subjective complaints from the patient, their objective data, including their lab values, any new imaging that they had, like a chest x-ray, any diagnostic tests like echo, and then we'll go see the patient together as a team, do a physical exam, and then come back as a team and formulate a plan going forward for that day. So my job as a fellow is to hear the residents, present the plan, give them some input, and loop in the nurses. They're part of our rounds, and the nurses ultimately help carry out the plans. in terms of the patient care. And then our team is responsible for coordinating some of the consults that we have to different services, like different surgical services or different medical services in the hospital. So my job is basically to manage the residents and make sure they're doing a good job at that. So when I was talking to this group of friends, I felt like I could explain that type of role to them and they could understand that from their own sort of workplace environment. One thing I was thinking about when I was on my ride up to Vermont was I've known these friends for over a decade now. And every time I see these friends, I feel like I revert back to who I was when we were friends back in college. And not in a bad way, but it just seems like time almost goes back in time and we're back in 2014 again. But what I expressed to them was I pretty much showed up at this job finishing my anesthesia training, and everybody was already looking at me like I was going to know all of the answers for the patient care in an ICU setting. Granted, I know a decent amount from my anesthesia experience and from my time in the ICUs during that training, but I certainly was no expert, and that's what I was hoping this year would help me achieve, is some level of expertise in this field. But the level of trust that they had in me and the expectation of my knowledge base, I don't know if it caught me off guard, but I guess I was slightly surprised at how much people trusted me right away. And it gives me a lot of confidence when people lay their trust in me. I take it with some pride and I take it very seriously. So if I'm going to give advice or formulate a plan, I do my homework and make sure that the plan is medically sound and we have all of the right consultants and the right framework in mind for the patient, for their best well-being and their interest in mind. But it's a cool feeling knowing that you have worked your way sort of up the ladder of residency and finally get to become that leader of the team, still with some supervision of the ICU attending who's on with you for that week. But it's a nice little middle ground to get your feet wet in terms of becoming that intensivist and leader in the ICU. So this theme of seeing myself like who I was when I was younger comes back into play when I think about talking to my parents about what my job entails. Sometimes I think it's hard for them to imagine their son being a doctor and doing the things that I do at my job, like putting in invasive lines or leading codes and being with people when they're at their sickest moment. Mainly because I was so vulnerable with them as a son and required a certain level of guidance along the way, just like any child. And for my parents not having any background in terms of medical training, in fact, most of their experience with hospital and medicine has been with their own parents and aunts and uncles and seeing them go through different medical ailments. I remember growing up as a kid, seeing both of my grandparents in ICU settings. And so I know my parents had to navigate a lot of those situations where you see your parent on a ventilator, but that's kind of always been their perspective, is from the patient side of things. Now, this is probably me just being self-conscious of myself and thinking to myself that I can't imagine what my parents must think I do at my job. But when I describe my job, I find myself almost pulling back some of the heroism and some of the extreme things that happen at my job. One, because some of it is just so ridiculous you wouldn't even believe it if I said it. But two, I almost want to make it seem more ground level for my parents and just easier to understand. And at times, perhaps it becomes oversimplified, but I always get a sense of pride from them, no matter how I describe what I'm doing. And I give them a lot of credit for keeping up with this whole process and being with me each step of the way these past 9 years of medical training. And they're very quick to celebrate every milestone along the way. So there's no sense of lack of pride at all. I definitely feel a lot of pride from my parents, and that's a very nice feeling. But I think over time, as I am better able to translate what I do to people outside of medicine. I'll be able to describe more of my scenarios to them to a degree, which leads me into my last population of people who I talk to, which is really just a population of one, and that's my wife. The other day we were talking and she asked how my patients were that day. And it was a very specific question that I gave very specific answers to. I talked about a few different patients. There was a few drunk drivers who were in the trauma ICU. I talked about a couple more young people who were going through traumatic events in life that required ICU level of care to the point of ventilators and potentially were going to end up chronically ill for a decent amount of time. And over the course of telling her these stories, I could just see it in her face that she was just becoming sadder and sadder and grimacing at times. And it made me appreciate just how sad these stories were because I think I was saying them in a very monotone voice and very matter of fact that this is just what my day was and who we talked about as a team. And I think there were even a couple times where I would chuckle at something that probably wasn't very appropriate to chuckle at, but that's always just been a bit of a coping mechanism on my part to deal with awkwardness with a little bit of laughter, even if it comes off as inappropriate. And towards the end of the conversation, after I've filled her with all of this sadness, she said to me, "You know, this is a lot of baggage for one person to carry. Do you think you should talk to a therapist?" And that's when I got to introduce her to the idea of CMO, where I was actually just going to do a podcast where I talk into a mic and talk about stuff like this. I could just see her roll her eyes in the back of her head, realizing that she was going to be subjected to having to listen to me create all of these podcast episodes. So inherently, she is my therapist indirectly. One thing I realized in this conversation was I subconsciously talked about all of the negative things that happened in the ICU, which isn't really typically my go-to conversation. And she picked up on that. She even said this is very different than the vibe you had in anesthesia, which was true because a lot of the times that we were taking care of patients in anesthesia, it was elective. And for the most part, patients were coming in pretty excited for surgeries. Obviously, there was emergent surgery, so those were a little bit different. But for a majority of cases throughout my training, they weren't necessarily so dark and gloomy, so to speak. So I decided after that conversation, my goal was to come home with more positive stories because there certainly are a lot of positive stories that we see in the ICU. The negative ones just tend to stick with you a little bit longer. And the more you talk about it, the more you just realize that you were exposed to such extreme ends of trauma. Just visually, the things you hear, the stimulation overload you have from all the beeping monitors and alarms that go off, and just emotionally how draining some of the family situations can be. And I really think, and it obviously depends on your personality type, but for me, suppressing my emotion was always the easier route. I was never really someone to ever really talk about my emotion, but I'm finding the more and more experience I have in this, and perhaps the more and more trauma that adds up to this, into this career of mine, I'm starting to see the value and the power of reflection and talking about how you handled or processed something that happened at work. One, because it gives you an opportunity to reflect on if you would have done something differently or better, and how maybe a different outcome could have played out if you had done something differently. But two, I think if you're able to actually hear yourself verbalize it, or at least talk to somebody else about it, you can gauge just how far off your reaction may be to a situation. It's easy to get emotionally invested into this job and into people's stories, but perhaps hearing a second opinion or hearing yourself say something out loud will help you realize if maybe what you're feeling is appropriate or not for that situation. While I'll admit that I'm not great at doing this for myself, I hope that as this year progresses, I find the opportunity and the time to at least help my residents and med students and nurses and other staff in the ICU process difficult emotional times in the ICU, and that collectively as a team, we can see our ways through tough times and come together and really trust each other in situations where we make ourselves vulnerable when we talk about emotions. And on that note, that wraps up the first episode of CMO. Thanks for listening along, and I hope throughout this year you hear a little bit of growth in this process for me, and I'm able to provide cool stories and medical mementos with some learning pearls along the way. Thanks for listening, guys, and I'll talk to you soon. If you like this episode of CMO, be sure to hit the subscribe button to the Behind the Drapes podcast, where you can hear more episodes just like this and have the new episodes downloaded to your homepage as they come out. If you want to check out some of the educational content that I put out, check out my social media page on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube, and that's at Keywords by Kenny, at KeywordsXKenny, and that'll get you to these short videos that I put out about different educational topics related to anesthesia and the ICU.